Tonight, the manhunt is on for Fat Leonard, the man accused of masterminding one of the biggest public corruption scandals in U.S. military history.
Leonard Francis was going to face sentencing in a few weeks, but officials say he cut off his GPS monitor Sunday and disappeared.
Well, welcome everyone to this special edition of the Fat Leonard podcast. If you've been following the news in the last week, you're probably as flabbergasted as I am. Fat Leonard is on the run. It's not something that I would have expected at all, to be honest. I mean, to do this just a few days away from sentencing, he was supposed to be sentenced in federal court on September 22, is really a rash act. If he's caught, he's going to go back to do a lot more jail time than he would have done if he'd been sentenced. And who knows, he's spent 9 years in detention already. So he could have got off with time served. Maybe he knew something that we don't know about how long he was going to do. Maybe he just got scared. And I'm going to talk a lot about that now in the next few minutes for this bonus episode. For those of you who don't know what happened, Leonard spent last week preparing to flee justice. He had a U-Haul removal van come to his home in San Diego. That's where he's been living for the last few years under 24-hour surveillance when he was let out in 2017 from jail because of kidney cancer. And so he moved to this house. He was under house arrest. He had a bracelet on his ankle, and a GPS-enabled bracelet that allowed the prison services to know where he was. And he moved everything out of his home. And we still don't understand how he was able to do this, given that he is under house arrest. How was he able to bring a U-Haul removal van into his home in San Diego? This is a 5-bedroom, multi-million-dollar home in a gated community in a suburb of the city. Anyway, he basically got rid of everything, was taken away in the truck, and we don't know where to. And then on Sunday morning, in the early hours, Leonard hacked off his GPS ankle bracelet, one that he'd shown me in the many interviews we'd done together. And he hacked it off with a pair of scissors and put the bracelet into a cool box. Now, I don't know why he did that. Maybe that was because he thought that would confuse people somehow or suppress the signal. I don't know, but that's what he did. And then he left. And I think the prison services were alerted by the fact that the bracelet had been broken, caused some sort of signal to go out. And that was in Sunday morning. But it took until much later on Sunday, I think 2 p.m., until the marshal services were alerted and actually went to his house. So by that point, I don't know, 5 hours later, Leonard is long gone. Now, we don't know who he's with. When I talked to him for the podcast, he was living with his 3 children, 2 of whom he had abducted from his Filipino girlfriend, Morena de Jesus, which we saw in episode 6 of the podcast. I know that Morena has been trying to get those children back, but as far as we know, they were still with him. And I've seen news reports that his mother was also living with him. And so it's possible that they all left together, but very difficult to go on the run with a family of 5 people. So I don't really know exactly how many there are or whether the children and mother have gone elsewhere. Obviously, they're not convicted of anything, so they're probably free to travel. Maybe Leonard's gone by himself. So yeah, let's talk about what he could have done and why he's done it, first of all. So I think he's gone on the run because I think he's worried that he's going to do a lot of time in jail. Now, why would he be worried about that? You know, the NCIS officer, Beliveau, who Leonard worked with, or Leonard bribed, he has gotten the longest sentence so far in this, which was 12 years. So I guess Leonard is looking at it and going, well, I was arrested in 2013, so I've done 9 years, and maybe I'll have to do 3 more. And I've got kidney cancer, and so I'm not willing to risk that, and I'm going to go on the run. The other reason I think he's decided to go on the run is that, and I think this is where the podcast itself comes into it. If you've listened to the podcast, at the end of it, when we discuss about the podcast coming out, Leonard gets very agitated and he says that he doesn't actually want the podcast to come out, even though he'd been speaking to me for over 6 months at that point. This is back in September last year.
I speak to you because I trust you. Do you understand, Tom?
No. I'm the guy that you came to tell your story, and I've done it.
Yes, but I mean, I just got to make sure that everything falls in place, because, this can just blow up in my face and, that'll be the end of me.
And he says things like, well, you're going to kill me with this podcast because it's going to mess me up with the government. At which point I say, well, I don't understand why we've been making this podcast. You talk at one point about how many life sentences can the judge give me.
course, I've got to face my judge one day, and it's all in her hands, that's about it. How many life sentences can you give me? 1, 2, 10?
He acts as if he didn't care about any of these things. And so to suddenly say, well, I don't want the podcast to come out, it made me realize that there was a lot of bravado in all of his talk with me over all those 25 hours of talking that we did for the podcast. And that actually, closer to the end of it, he was very worried that the podcast was going to blow him up and cause huge problems for him with his plea deal. And I think it did so, because back in June, Leonard was supposed to be the star witness for the government of 5 Navy officers who were on trial back then. And they pulled him from the witness stand. And they've never given any explanation for why they did that. But I think it's because by doing the podcast, he'd become basically useless for them as a witness, because the jury probably told not to listen to the podcast, but they probably did. And in it, Leonard is saying all kinds of things that would make him less reliable witness. And then, of course, the defense counsel for those 5 Navy officers, they subpoenaed the raw tapes of our interviews with Leonard. We fought that because we believed it was an attack on journalistic First Amendment protections, but we lost and we had to hand over the tapes. We put them out publicly. And what they were trying to do, the defense counsel, was to say that Leonard is not a reliable government witness, that he was saying all these kinds of things like, for example, there was one part of the conversation with me where you could interpret it to mean that Leonard was saying that, I have to maintain my status as a cancer patient because otherwise I can't be under home release. I'll be back in prison. So they tried to make him seem, basically impeach him as a witness. And the government decided not to put him up there. So I think, given all of that background, those 5 Navy officers, 4 of them were convicted and they're awaiting sentencing. And now Leonard was the last piece of the chess puzzle. And he was going to be sentenced on September the 22nd. And he's looked at all of this absolute mess that's happened since the podcast has come out. And he said, look, I need to take action into my own hands and I'm going to go on the run. So I think something like that is what's happened. Maybe also his cancer is very bad. We don't know. But that could also have pushed him to roll the dice, because if he's close to the end of his life, then going on the run isn't as risky a decision as it would be if he was healthy. So those are my thoughts about why he did it. So now I want to talk to you about where he may have gone. Obviously guesswork here. I've reached out to his family and to Leonard, and I haven't heard back anything. He has apart from the young teenagers who are with him, those 3 children from 2 Filipino women, he has 2 older boys from another marriage. And one of those lives in Kuala Lumpur, and he's his sort of eldest son, the one who would take over the family business. They have a family home in Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia. He could be headed there, or he could be headed somewhere else in Asia. I know that he told me during our talks that he's had houses in Japan, the Philippines. He had a Japanese Brazilian girlfriend and a place in Tokyo. He had a place in Manila, and I think he had a place in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. So those are all potential places he could go. We'd have to look at the extradition treaties between the US and those places. Places that don't have them, like Vietnam, would be very attractive for Leonard for sure. Then we have to think about money. Okay, so he pleaded guilty to helping steal $35 million, but his business at one point was a $100 million business. I've talked to someone who saw his accounts, and he had revenues of $100 million. And I actually talked to him at one point about whether he had any of the money left. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about what he said. I said, "You're not a cash billionaire, but you've got assets worth millions somewhere in the world." And he responded, "Yeah, I had business in 30 over countries, and I ran my business for 25 years. And he goes on to talk about still having assets. And he says, "I'm not going to move them. You don't move it again because then they'll get it." So he's talking about the US government. So he's still got money for sure. We don't know how much, but I'd imagine he's still got millions of dollars, if not tens of millions of dollars that he can use. And that's important if you're on the run, because you need to pay off people, right? So how has he gotten out of the US? There's so many unanswered questions. Has he paid off the private security that was supposed to be guarding him at his house? He actually paid for himself. When the judge, San Martino, the judge in the federal court in San Diego, allowed him to go on medical furlough at home, he had to pay for his own security. And there was one issue, December 2020, I believe, where somebody from the prison services went to check up on him, and there was no guard there. So the judge got annoyed, and that was supposed to be tightened up. So there are so many questions about how a removal truck was able to turn up at his house and just unload all of his goods. So has Leonard paid people off in these circumstances with a lot of money to to allow this to happen. And we'll find that out, I'm sure. Something will come out. Either we'll find that out or a local reporter in San Diego will find it out. Then how did he get out of the country? The Mexican border is only 40 miles from where he was living, so he could have gone that way. Or, I mean, I'm imagining his belongings ended up going somewhere, maybe a container ship. He's been in shipping for 40 years. He knows so many people who own ship lines, commercial shipping, all those kinds of people in that world. Maybe he persuaded somebody to allow him to get into a container. I mean, I guess he wouldn't be doing that if he was with his kids and his elderly mother, but by himself perhaps. Or maybe he's still in the States. We just don't know any of those things. But as I said, he's got a lot of cash. And if you're going on the run, being able to pay people is really, really important because they're taking a risk for you, obviously. So yeah, that's about the limit of my thinking about what's going on with Leonard. And now we're just going to have to wait to see what transpires because this is an incredible outcome for this story, one that I at least, even though I knew he still had money, I would not have expected him to do. Don't forget, he spent 9 years since being arrested waiting for his sentencing. So to leave 2 weeks away from that date is something that I think is quite shocking. And the Fat Leonard story is not yet over, so we'll keep covering it here in future bonus episodes. Stay tuned.
I felt free at sea, and being in the ocean with the sea, the breeze, the wind, the smell, everything, give you this feeling of being a free person.